It appears as though police in our province are enforcing the COVID-19 rules more thoroughly. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton. Tyler, the enforcement included the arrest of Calgary street preacher Archer Pawlowski, people running the Whistle Stop Cafe and Mirror in central Alberta, and the organizers of the Bowden Rodeo.
That's right. So there's a couple developments that sort of led to this point. The first was a press conference early last week where Kenny was talking about a lack of compliance among Albertans as a contributing factor to the third wave. And Casey Madhu, the justice minister, then said that there was going to be sort of a team set up to coordinate the responses to scofflaws, basically, because throughout the pandemic, it's been kind of unclear who's in charge of enforcing these things. Is it Alberta Health? Are the police involved? Is it occupational health and safety? So this was sort of to coordinate an interagency response. And then on Thursday, the development was that Alberta Health Services went to court and got an injunction preventing a handful of people from organizing what the court called illegal public gatherings. Now, what this does basically is allows the police to sort of enforce these rules without Alberta Health Services being present. So basically just clarifies police powers a whole bunch. Then the obvious consequence of that is you saw the Pawlowski brothers arrested over the weekend. You saw some arrests, one arrest and ticketing at the Whistle Stop event that you mentioned, and the Bowden Rodeo, which happened sort of, I think, first weekend of May. The organizers of that were issued a summons to go to court in Red Deer. So there's sort of been a chain of events, I would say, over the past couple weeks here that have led to a place where this criticism of the UCP's handling of the pandemic, i.e. a lack of enforcement, has now become much more apparent.
And Alberta Justice Minister Casey Madhu mentioned as well recently about the fine being increased from $1,000 to $2,000. Now, Tyler, speaking of Madhu, Minister Madhu, he found himself in a little bit of hot water this week and offered an apology on social media. Can you explain what transpired?
Yeah, so a sign I think that tensions are sort of running high everywhere. So the minister was responding to a Facebook post and he was trying to explain why the government had gone ahead with this next set of restrictions. He said, look, there's strain on our hospitals. We can't wait for the hospital system to collapse before we do something. We have to act now, which is, basically what Kenny's been saying, basically what everyone's been saying. But what he did say after that was, we can't let the hospital system collapse. That is what the media, the NDP, and the Liberals would like to see happen. And the backlash to that was fairly substantial and immediate. Journalists posting about family members they've lost, politicians condemning it from Ottawa, from Edmonton. And then the Premier was asked about it on Tuesday evening, and he said, I haven't seen the post yet. And then a couple hours later, Madhu came out and said, look, I was wrong to say this. That's not what I meant. So he climbed down from that one fairly quickly. But, I think it's a sign to some extent of, just how tense everyone is right now.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The anxiety, the depression, with all of this, not just impacting us, but our politicians as well. Tyler, we're about a week into the latest round of COVID-19 restrictions, which ended in-person dining, even on our patios outside. That kills me, especially with our beautiful weather here in southern Alberta. Premier Kenny, in announcing them, said this is the final push before the vaccines take hold, or stop the spike, as the UCP puts it.
Yeah, and we are seeing, I would say, pretty substantial vaccine uptake. It sort of opened up to the younger generation in the past week or so, and it certainly seems like everyone I know anyways is posting their selfies on social media, out there getting their shots. So that's the hope, of course, that this is going to be a few weeks more shut down, patios will be closed, retail, of course, limited to fewer people, houses of worship under similar rules to that, in-person gatherings, outdoor gatherings are restricted. It's a back to the future thing a little bit. We've seen these rules before, but the weather is getting nicer, so it's a little bit harder to stomach, perhaps. But of course, the vaccines are on the way, and that's sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, the North Star that everyone's looking at this point, I think, just hoping that we're going to have a summer here.
Absolutely. The spring sitting at the Legislature was suspended, but may be back soon. This has meant that there has been no question period fireworks lately. Committee work is ongoing virtually, but no other work, including debating bills, is going on, and some politicians want to debate paid sick leave.
Yeah, so that's why it's been so quiet lately. I was thinking about it this week that it doesn't seem like there's been all that much going on, which is, not the case, but you don't see the headlines and the fireworks to the same extent. So if you back up about a week, the UCP decided that they were not going to bring the legislature back for 2 weeks. Now, the reasoning for this was that they had been on a constituency week before that, so they'd been back in their constituencies with their families, perhaps seeing some people here and there, and they didn't want to bring COVID back to the legislature. So sitting was suspended for a couple weeks. The work, as you said, being done in committee is all being done virtually, but considerably harder to run a question period or something like that, or debate bills virtually. So that hasn't been happening. And now the New Democrats, of course, saying there's lots that ought to be debated right now. Paid sick leave being one of the big ones. So they haven't been happy about that. But from a political angle on the whole thing, there's been a lot of criticism of the government at this point in time. They've had a a rough go of it the last few weeks. So there's sort of the reason they gave of protecting the legislature from infection, but on the flip side, a cynic might say they just wanted to be away from the limelight for a couple weeks.
Well, I think you and I also talked about at one point in time there was an outbreak at Kenny's office, right?
Yeah, there'd been a handful of people who'd fallen ill, and the UCP did say that this was not linked to any specific infections, but you never know what could come back in while people were at home.
Tyler, thanks to a deal between the U.S. State Department and the province, thousands of Alberta truckers can now get vaccines from neighboring Montana, and the vaccines will be offered at rest stops along I-95. Now, what's important here is that it keeps trade open between the two jurisdictions.
So obviously, there's a ton of cross-border truck traffic. Throughout the pandemic, truckers have been one of the sort of few groups that have been able to go back and forth between the United States. So the agreements between the Montana government and the Alberta government, and truckers will be able to get, I believe it's the one-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine when they're in Montana. Now, of course, it immediately made me think that Montana must have some wonderful rest stops if that's where they're going to be, offering vaccinations, because gosh, I wouldn't want to get any medical thing done in some of the ones we've got here. But the idea, of course, is that it will keep trade open more easily. People don't need to worry as much about bringing infection back across the border, worrying about bringing infection back to their families, things like that. Now, the other thing worth mentioning on this front is that Manitoba actually has a similar deal in place with North Dakota, which borders them. And then Ontario has been discussing with its neighboring states the possibility of doing something similar. So, of course, this is trading off on the fact that the United States simply has a little bit better, well, a lot better COVID-19 vaccine supply than we do.
Now let's talk about Enbridge Line 5 and the shutdown. The governor of Michigan wants it completely shut down, but Tyler, does it not provide a lot of fuel and home heating fuel to the state? I mean, first the issues with Biden pulling the presidential permit to the Keystone XL pipeline expansion, and now this.
So that's fundamentally the big issue from the Alberta perspective. Of course, this pipeline running through sort of central Canada, not an Alberta specific pipeline like Keystone XL was. But Enbridge, the company behind it, of course, headquartered in Calgary. So there is an Alberta link to this, of course. But the broader fear from the government, is that if this pipeline can be shut down, such an important pipeline, as you say, bringing in so much fuel, if that can be shut down, it sort of is nothing sacred. So for the Alberta government, which has this real concern about getting its product to market, getting it across the U.S. border, getting it to Tidewater in Canada, this is just sort of a line in the sand to some extent, a bulwark that the government wants to ensure that this project does not get canceled, or I shouldn't say canceled, shut down for sort of political reasons. And it's also notable, I would say, because you have the federal government really taking the lead on this, it seems. They've filed the court documents. They've been in discussion with their counterparts in the United States. But I should add that on Wednesday afternoon, Rachel Notley's New Democrats came out and said that Kenny needs to step up on this, needs to take the lead on it. In classic political opposition behavior, they didn't really offer much by way of suggestions about how to do that, but they were calling on the premier to come out and perhaps make a statement or do something more forceful on this front.
You know what I find really interesting too, with a lot of opposition parties, they always complain about what the current government is doing instead of coming out with solutions. It's like, let's attack, but we have no solutions ourselves. But we're going to keep attacking.
That's half the fun of it. I mean, in some ways you think, why would you ever want to be in government? It's so much more fun to be in opposition, I
Right?
think.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess kind of like in the movies. I want to be the bad guy, not the good guy all the time, right? I want to
Yeah,
be the bad guy.
exactly.
Now, the province is giving $1.5 million to help family resource centers across the province, including here in Lethbridge. Now, speaking of a good guy, now will this help support a lot of families with disabilities?
Yeah, so these resource centers sort of exist around the province. There's a whole bunch of them, and this money's been given out as grant funding to sustain and expand programs, start a couple new programs, I believe. So these are generally centers that help families that have, say, children or relatives with developmental disabilities who need services and support. So little bit of good news spending from the Alberta government, and as we sort of talk about every time, it just goes to show that there are things going on in the background of Alberta politics that aren't just COVID-19 or aren't just oil and gas. There's other stuff happening too, of course.
Tyler, wildfire season is just around the corner. Southern Alberta's already had to deal with a whole host of grass fires. Now, the province has announced further use of drones to survey for fires and hotspots during the 2021 fire season.
So they put out a press release basically detailing some of this new technology that they're going to be using and expanding the use of this year. And one of them was drones, sort of surveying fire areas to, check the size of the fire, to look for hot spots where fires might emerge, things like that. They also talked about some of the other technologies, such as, sort of this gel-like water substance that they are going to be spraying on fires. So they're not just dumping, buckets of water. They want this gel, the more gelatinous water that, I mean, I'm not the scientist here, Hal, but that's what they're planning on, and the idea is that it's going to stick a little bit better and help extinguish the fires. So, we had, I think last year had a relatively light fire season, but obviously there have been years when they have not been light fire seasons, and I'm not sure what it's like down in Lethbridge, but man, is it ever dry up here. So it's for the best, I would say that they seem to be really planning ahead on this season.
Well, I got to say, my neighbors' lawns are looking nice and green. I've got kind of a gravel lawn, so it's low maintenance, but I mean, my trees are really appreciating and all the moisture we've had lately. And of course, there's also the 2017 Keno wildfires. We remember those quite well here in southern Alberta, which almost devastated the entire town of Waterton. So yeah, any moisture and any help we can get is definitely appreciated this time of year. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.